we left off last week. We're kind of halfway through this second chapter that's dealing with the question of what difference does it make if God exists? And so just kind of as a review, what did we talk about last week? Can anyone remember?
The spaceman who accidentally drank the not poisoned potion.
Okay.
We were talking about like how life has no meaning.
All right. Well, okay, let's talk about those two things for a minute. So why does life have no meaning if God doesn't exist? What did we talk about?
Because without God in it, there's no place where we came from. There's no place where we're going. There's no destiny or anything.
Right. So we talked about how you're answering the four fundamental questions of life, and that what do we say? The answer to those four fundamental questions make up your what?
Your religion.
Or your views on life.
Your worldview, right? So that's how you see everything, and that's how you answer questions about like what should you do and how should you do it, and like kind of the bedrock questions of like existence in your life, right? Are those four questions, which again, and this is kind of where I want to pick it up today. If you talk to people, like talk to your friends, like, have you ever thought about what the meaning of life is? They kind of look at you like, what are you, weird? Like, but that's a good, like, that's the fundamental question, right? Like, you should. Like, do you ever think about how we got here? I had a kid in class, and I go through the three monotheistic religions in my class. And so this kid was just like not interested in any of this stuff at all. And I said, well, because I bring this type of thing in, and I say, like, it seems like everybody should be interested in these sorts of things, right? And he's like, I don't care. I said, well, it seems to me that like it does matter whether your answers to these questions are correct, right? That would seem to be important. Like, is this all there is? Is it when I die? Is that it? Because if that's true, that would change the decisions that I make in my life, wouldn't it? I mean, like we said last week, the rational thing to do would be to maximize my pleasure while I'm here for the short time that I'm here, right? I shouldn't really do anything that I don't find enjoyable, because I'm not going to be here that long. And if this is all there is, why in the world would I spend my life doing things that I don't enjoy? That would be silly, right? But if there is something else after death, and there is a God, and he is going to judge me based on how I lived my life and how my life should be, then that changes the decisions that I make in my life, doesn't it? And so therefore I might live a life of suffering if I'm doing it to serve that God, knowing that in the end, he is going to reward that, and that my existence will go on forever. Like that, I mean, you can't think of anything more fundamental to that. And that's why I talked to this kid about this. He's like, I don't care. And I said, really? He's like, yeah. He's like, I'll find out when I die if my answers were right. And I was like, well, then it's too late, right? Like, wouldn't you want to know now? And so that's kind of where I wanted to jump in. But let's, before we get into that, what else did we talk about? Remember anything else? I read a couple things to you.
Oh yeah, you read about the what was that? The madman.
The madman. What was the point of the parable of the madman?
Kind of like.
And this is kind of connected to what I just said. Remember, the madman comes in and he's saying, where's God? Where's God? And they all start laughing at him and making fun of him. And he says, I'll tell you where God is. He's dead. And we've killed him. And then he goes on to talk about all the consequences of killing God. And then at the end, he just kind of looks at them, and they're looking at him. And what was the point of the whole thing? He said, this deed, though done by them, is more distant to them than the most distant stars, even though they've done it themselves, right? And he said, like thunder, lightning, it requires time, and the light from the stars requires time. Remember, what was the point of that whole parable?
Was it that the world doesn't like understand what happened?
Kind of, like, explain it a little bit more. Like, what do you mean?
Like understand what we did and understand the consequences. of it?
There you go. The consequences. So they don't believe in God, but then they still live as if the things that only exist with God exist, right? So, and that's kind of where I want to get into the book this week. And I'm going to start on page 39 where it says the practical impossibility of atheism. And yes, go ahead.
So like they don't believe that there is a God, but they still believe in a moral system.
Mm-hmm.
That there's right and wrong, but without God, there's nothing.
Right. That's part of it. Okay. So let me read a quote. This quote is a little convoluted, but I like it. And the more I think about it, the more I think it's true. This is from a guy named Os Guinness. And he says, there are therefore two poles. And that's why I drew this little picture here. So I have God's reality here in the middle. And then on this side, I have the dilemma pole. Or think of the North Pole and the South Pole, right? So these are the extreme sides of here. So God's reality is in the middle. You have the dilemma pole, which is more consistent. And then you have the diversion pole, which is less consistent. So here's what he says. There are therefore two poles in the unbelieving mind and heart, which I call the dilemma pole and the diversion pole. The dilemma pole expresses the logic of the fact that the more consistent people are to their own view of reality, the less close they are to God's reality, and the more likely they are to feel their dilemma. So remember, last week I also read that quote from Bertrand Russell. Remember, it was called The Free Man's Worship. And he talked about how only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair can the soul's habitation henceforth be built. In other words, he recognized that there is no meaning, there is no purpose. We're just here by he said, by the accidental collocation of atoms, that it's just all an accident, and that nothing that you do, remember he said no heroism, nothing that man has ever done will last, and we're all doomed to death in the extinction of the solar system or the universe, and the heat death of the universe. That's the dilemma pole, right? But remember, what did we even say about Bertrand Russell? Could he live consistently like that? No, and he talks about that in the book, how he even said, I forget, he quotes him here somewhere. It says like, I find the whole thing like fantastic or something like that. Bertrand, oh, here it is. In page 42, he says, Bertrand Russell, too, was inconsistent, for though he was an atheist, he was an outspoken social critic denouncing war and restrictions on sexual freedom. Russell admitted that he could not live as though ethical values were simply a matter of personal taste, and that he therefore found his own views incredible. Quote, I do not know the solution, he confessed. So that's the dilemma pole. There's those people, like Bertrand Russell, who understand the situation, and they're just like, it's a dilemma. Right. Then you have, he says, the diversion pole. And this is where I think most people are. I have good friends who are, I would classify them in the diversion pole. I have family members who I would classify in the diversion pole. Right. And this says the diversion pole expresses the fact that the less consistent people are to their own view of reality, the closer they are to God's reality. So the more they must find a diversion. So in other words, what that's saying is they want to affirm the things that we would say are true. Like they want to affirm that there is a meaning in life. They want to affirm that there are moral values. They want to affirm that there's some purpose and value to things. But they don't want to live as if, like, and sometimes they even say that there's a God, but they don't want the real God. They want their version of God, right? They don't want God's reality. They want their reality. So most of the time, because if you talk to people about this and you point them, you're like, well, let's be consistent here. And you walk them through, they don't like that. They're like, well, I don't want to talk about that. And so they don't think about it, right? They want to be distracted all the time. So they watch movies and they read books and they go on walks and they, do whatever they do so they don't have to think about these things. Because if they think about it, they're presented with the conflict there, that this, like my version of reality doesn't match the way things have to be. Like I can't have like, well, it's your truth and my truth, all that sort of stuff. That would all fall into the diversion. And I think, again, when you talk to people who are unbelievers, you'll find that that's a very real representation. Either they recognize, like, yeah, I don't match up with what you're talking about, and again, I'm inconsistent, but that's just the way that it is. Or they're like, I don't want to talk about that. I don't like that's your thing. I'm happy that you found something that makes life meaningful for you, but that's not for me. Like, and you're like, wait, what? I talked to somebody, and they were like, we went through all the stuff, and I was like talking about like the Bible and stuff, and finally I was like, well, how did you arrive at your view of things? And they were like, intuition. And I was like, okay. What if your intuition's wrong? Like, have you ever like looked up any of this stuff or looked into it? Because they were like, well, the Bible was written by men. How do I know? Like, and I was like, well, have you looked into that? I could give you an answer, but are you interested? And they're like, no, not really. Okay. And they were definitely in the diversion pole because they didn't want to talk about anything. They just like, they're like, I'm happy with the way that I look at things, and we'll just let it like that. So, okay. All right. And I think like the example that he gives of Francis Schaeffer, where he says on page 39, Francis Schaeffer says that modern man resides in a two-story universe. And so he has a picture of this on page 40. And he says that in the upper story, that's where you have God and meaning and value and purpose in life. But in the lower story, you have essentially what's called naturalism. What does naturalism mean? Because I'll use that term a bit today. I want to make sure we all are on the same page. What does naturalism mean?
I think that means that like there's no supernatural, everything is just like there's nothing, I guess, unnatural.
Yes, you're exactly right.
Science explains everything.
Yeah.
Right, so there's nothing supernatural, which again, if there's nothing supernatural, and I think we've talked about this before, right? There's nothing supernatural, then the only thing that really exists is what makes everything up. Everything's made up of what? Matter. Right, so there's nothing immaterial. There's nothing that's not made of matter. So there's no spiritual realm, right? There's no force, like there's just matter. You're made of matter. I'm made of matter. That's all there is, right? And so the lower story, that's what we're talking about. If there's no God, remember, that's all there is. But the problem, he says, is that he can't live happily in such an absurd world. And this gets back to this, right? So either you have to recognize that I'm down in the lower story and I don't have those things, or you want those things, but you have to just kind of forget about all the inconsistencies of things. And so he said, but he continually makes leaps of faith into the upper story to affirm meaning, value, and purpose, even though he has no right to do so, since he does not believe in God. And this I find to be where our culture sits today. I had to take a class, it was a required class at Lehigh, and it was diversity and multicultural instruction or something like that. Did the TV just move?
Yes.
An earthquake.
No, that's my fault.
Oh.
So just push it a little bit. Center, there you go. All right. So, but in this class, like the whole class was all about social justice and equality. Like in my school right now, they have this diversity, like it's part of the school improvement plan, like about we want to be an anti-racist school and all these types of things, right? It's all like we have to do in-service things and all this stuff. And essentially everything that they're doing is upper story type stuff, right? I mean, that's all well and good if you have a worldview that's based on the reality of God, right? But if you don't have God, then you don't have justice. There's no such thing as justice because justice is a moral term. I had another class at Lehigh where I had a professor who was, she was a lesbian, and she was very much into social justice and women's rights and all these types of things. So like everything that she taught in the class was geared towards promoting pushing these views, right? And so we had to read these journal articles, this peer-reviewed educational journal things. And so then we would talk about them as a class. And so we got to the one on social justice, right? And so like, she was like, does anyone have any comments on it? And no one was going to say anything. So I was like, well, so I raised my hand and I said, well, again, the idea of justice implies some kind of objective morality, doesn't it? Because if there's no objective morality, where do you get justice from? Because you're dealing with good, bad, right, and wrong, aren't you? And where do you get good, bad, right, or wrong? It's just your opinion. Because if my opinion is different than your opinion, then how can the judge arbitrate between the two of us, right? And so I was like, well, that's kind of a deeper conversation. And I was like, I could explain it if you want to. And I think she thought that I wasn't going to do it. She's like, oh, go ahead, go up to the board, take the chalk, show us. And I was like, are you serious? She's like, yeah. Okay. So I went up and we'll do that when we get to the chapter of morality. So I went through the whole thing. And after I was done, I was like, well, and so here we are, right? And she was like, okay, thank you. So let's take a 15-minute break. She had nothing else to say, right? Because again, what you're forcing them to see, like you can't talk about, and let me get back to the other class I had. I had a conversation with the professor about this. I said, look, you're starting this whole class with the assumption that we should treat people equally and that people have value, that as a human being, they're intrinsically worth something, that we shouldn't just kill people, that there's justice, that you have the ability to use your mind to reason, to change your attitudes, because the whole idea of this class is to change my views and make sure that I have the proper views that you want. I said, but none of those things exist without God. I said, so, and I used this illustration, I said, you're up here, you have to ground that somehow, right? I said, and you can't ground it without God. And he was like, yeah, but we don't want to get into all that. I'm like,
Okay.
you see what happens? And that's where most, like all the stuff that's going on today about equity and equality and fairness and all this sort of stuff, you're up in the second story. And essentially you're stealing, to use a term from a guy named Frank Turek, you're stealing from God. You're taking these ideas that only exist on a Judeo-Christian worldview, and you're trying to take those things, but you don't, it's like we want the good stuff, but we don't want God. And you can't do that, okay? And I've added on to my thing here, also, like I said, free will, reason, justice, rights. Some of you guys, when we did that whole atheist type of thing, brought in the idea of your mind and consciousness. Have you ever thought about that? I want to show you a video from the guy that wrote the book here about that. But I mean, if we're all just made of material, if God doesn't exist, if naturalism is all that there is, then everything that goes on in your mind is happening as a result of the laws of physics and chemistry. Well, physics, because chemistry operates according to physics, right? So everything that's going on in your head, your DNA is already programmed. And so I'm getting all these, like I'm seeing the light and it's going through my optic nerve and it's causing electrical responses and chemical reactions. And I'm hearing you scratch on the table, right? And stuff like that. And I can feel things and it's just causing these reactions. But all that's happening beyond my control. And even my sense of self-awareness on a naturalistic point of view would be an illusion because I'm not really in control. I'm just doing what I'm programmed to do. Just like birds that migrate, they just do it. Like no one has to teach them that. They just like, they've done experiments where they take a bird and put it somewhere else and then they let it go and it goes right back to where it was supposed to be, right? How do you know that? It's just programmed to do it. So all the things that we do, like you doing that right now, would be programmed into you and you're not doing it by choice, which means, think about let me ask you this before I show you the video. What are the consequences of that? If everything that I do, there's a word for it called determinism. Everything that I do is determined. What are the consequences of determinism?
That means that like our choices don't matter at all.
Your choices are really an illusion, aren't they?
Yeah.
So you're not really making the choice.
Yeah.
You're just doing what you're
just doing
programmed
what
to
we're
do.
programmed to do.
So that means that you don't have reason, right? It's not like you thought about my question and thought about it and then answered it after rationally kind of running it through your head. That's just what you were programmed to do. But again, that goes against everything within us, right? Because remember, part of the coherence test for truth is experiential relevance. Is it relevant to my experience? Boy, it certainly seems like we all have the ability to do things or not do things. Why did I do that? Was I programmed to do that? It seems like I'm choosing to do that. For what reason? There is no reason. I just wanted to make an example of it, right? So that means that there's no reason. If there's no reason, what else don't you have? If you can't reason things out and choose and make choices about things, if you don't have any reason, you can't do science. See, so like they're like science. They're like, well, lower story, man. You don't have God, you're determined. So there's actually C.S. Lewis and then Alvin Plantinga, a professor of philosophy, he's retired at Notre Dame, actually came up with a very sophisticated, which I'm not going to get into now, but argument against evolution, just from the fact that from an evolutionary standpoint, your behavior is not, or your mind is not really, it doesn't have to necessarily figure out what's true, it just has to have survivability. Right? So if I run away from a fire, and it keeps me alive, it doesn't matter if my reasons for running away from the fire are true or not, it just matters that I stay alive. Right? So I'm not evolved to come to the truth of things, I'm just evolved to come to decisions that keep me alive. So then that undermines my confidence in my ability to know what's true. Does that make sense? This is getting a little complicated, but you know what I'm saying? So you don't have science, you don't have reason. What else don't you have if you don't have the ability to think? Which is one of these 4 questions.
Oh, like no morals?
No morals. Because I'm just programmed to do, I'm born that way, to quote a famous singer, right? But if I'm born that way, then that applies to all behavior too. Again, you can't just pick and choose, can you? Because no behavior is objectively wrong if that's the way you're born. So let's say I'm born a kleptomaniac. You know what that is?
The person
You steal compulsively. Well, why are you judging me, man? Why are you judging me? That's just how I am. That's how I was born, right? Let's say you're a child molester. Like, hey, I was born that way. You see what I'm saying? It's a slippery slope, isn't it? All of a sudden, nothing's wrong because everybody's just programmed to do what they're doing. And again, I've listened to atheists talk about these things and they're just like, they can't be consistent because they're like, well, we should definitely put those people in jail. Why? Right? Just because they're not programmed the right way or something? Like that seems to be discriminatory, isn't it? Right.
They probably think like they're defective or something.
Right. So but again, defective according to what standard? You don't have a standard, right? There's no standard. If there's no God, there's no standard. And so again, like, can you live? And that's the correspondence test for truth. Can you live consistently? No, you can't. So you either have to just divert your attention or come to the grips that like, yeah, I don't know, right? But either way, it tells you what, this can't be true because it fails the test of truth. All right, so let me share my screen. I want to show you this video that talks about this, as I think it's.
Are no more than biological machines built by DNA for the purpose of passing it on. Just as the universe is comprised only of matter, we too are purely physical objects. Naturalism tells us that nothing exists beyond the physical world. If we cannot measure it, see it, or touch it, it does not exist. By following the scientific method, we have discovered the laws of physics, the descriptions of how our physical universe normally and consistently behaves. But according to naturalism, mankind is no different than its habitat. Since the universe obeys the laws of physics, we too are wholly subject to them. You may have thought that a series of free choices has brought you to where you are today. But according to naturalism, free will does not exist. Since human beings are merely physical entities, we are bound by the laws of cause and effect. Our actions today can be traced back to prior physical causes. The result, all of your actions have been predetermined since the universe began. Naturalists do not shy away from this consequence of their worldview. The evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins and the neuroscientist Sam Harris affirmed that all of our actions are causally determined. Stephen Hawking agreed. Scientific determinism must hold for people as well. Free will is an illusion. Once one comes to terms with naturalism, the world is seen through a different lens. The individual is reduced to a puppet, moving about at the mercy of the laws of nature. Although we think that our minds are responsible for bringing about our actions, we are mistaken. For if there is no immaterial part of a person, then even your thoughts are predetermined. These naturalistic ideas have consequences. Society is built upon the assumption that human beings are responsible for their own actions. How can someone be punished for wrongdoing if he could not choose to do otherwise? Without free will, we cannot be either blamed or praised for our decisions and actions. Richard Dawkins just shrugs these implications off, commenting, "This is just an inconsistency we have to live with." Fortunately, determinism itself is not an inevitable conclusion, for there is no evidence that determinism is true. On the contrary, the very concept of rationally affirming determinism is self-defeating. For to rationally accept something as true, you must have the freedom to weigh the evidence. But if determinism is true, then there is no true deliberation. Everything is the result of prior causes, including the acceptance of determinism. Naturalism also fails to give a tenable account of our mental lives. It tells us that human consciousness and the physical brain are identical. Mental experiences can be wholly described in terms of specific brain states and the firing of neurons. But that doesn't make sense, for the brain, as a physical substance, has only physical properties. But the brain doesn't have mental properties. The brain is not happy. The brain itself isn't afraid. You can't reduce fear to a physical brain state. If there is just one difference between a mental state and a brain state, then they are not identical, and naturalism is false. How then do we give an adequate account of our mental lives? How do we harmonize our deep intuitions of human freedom with what physics tells us about the world? The answer may be found in a familiar concept, the soul. For thousands of years, the soul was believed to give man the ability to think and decide freely. If we have immaterial souls, which can affect our bodies, then we are not enslaved by physical determinism. The inadequacy of a naturalistic worldview should cause us to reflect on the true nature of reality. Is there an immaterial realm that underpins it all? Should we just throw up our hands and say, this is an inconsistency we have to live with? The choice is yours.
Mommy was going to take it long.
I'm going to show you another video in a second, but continuing on in the chapter here, then he starts talking about the meaning of life. And he quotes Jean-Paul Sartre, or some people call it Sartre. He argued that one may create meaning for his life by freely choosing to follow a certain course of action. What's wrong with that right off the bat? If what we just saw is true, can you freely choose the course of action? No. See what I mean? It just, the hole you're in just keeps getting deeper and deeper. Okay. But he's like, let's pretend the universe has meaning. So we've already kind of talked about meaning life. Then he goes on to talk about value. Values are good and bad, right? Or something like the worth of something. And he talks about those scenes from Auschwitz and the Nazis, what they did to people. Did you read that stuff?
Yeah.
Horrible, absolutely horrible. And then but he says on 43, and yet if God does not exist, then in a sense, our world is Auschwitz. There is no right and wrong. All things are permitted. But here again, here's the rub. No atheist, no agnostic can live consistently with such a view. See, there's the rub again. You have this problem, okay? And he talks about Richard Dawkins, who, though he says there is no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference, he's an unabashed moralist. And he condemns actions like harassment and abuse of homosexuals, religious indoctrination of children, human sacrifice, and so on. Let me show you an interview. This is from a movie called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And I find this interesting.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. How are you? I'm Ben Stein. I'm so sorry to keep you waiting. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
You have written that God is a psychotic delinquent invented by mad, deluded people.
No, I didn't. Didn't say quite that. I said something rather better than that.
Oh, well, please tell us what you said. Please tell us what you said.
Well, I would have to read it from the book.
No, please.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
So that's what you think of God?
Yeah.
Now, again, what's the problem with that?
Where are you getting that standard?
Yeah, according to who? According to you, the same guy who just said there is at bottom no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Right? That's his own view. But yet he's criticizing God because you're wrong in this and you did this and that's bad and this is bad. There is no such thing as good and bad on his own view. That's what I'm saying. You can't be consistent. It doesn't work. Right? So he writes a whole book about all this stuff, like telling how evil God is. But if there is no God, there's no such thing as evil. Right? That make sense?
And isn't he all for like acceptance and stuff?
Well, he was a biology professor at Oxford. So here, let me finish this.
How about people believe in a God of infinite lovingness and kindness and forgiveness and generosity, sort of like the modern day God? Why spoil us for them?
Oh,
Why not just let them have their fun and enjoy it?
I mean, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. I write a book, people can read it if they want to. I believe that it is a liberating thing to free yourself from primitive superstition.
So religion.
Why? Because that means you can do whatever you want without consequence. And that's what it comes down to. They don't want somebody that is ultimately their judge and the one who, like, they don't want to submit to God. That's essentially what it is. I want to be my own God and run my own life, right? Like the Billy Joel song, go ahead with your own life, leave me alone. Like, don't tell me what to do. Frank Sinatra, I did it my way.
Is it primitive
Oh,
superstition?
I think it is, yes.
So you believe it's liberating to tell people that there is no God?
I think a lot of people, when they give up God, feel a great sense of release and freedom.
Why do you think that? I mean, what's your
Well,
data? What's your scientist? What's your data?
I think, well, I've had a lot of letters saying that, and I've
There are 8 billion people in the world,
Yeah,
Dr.
I know.
Dawkins. How many letters have you
no,
had?
I haven't done that. That's quite true.
Professor Dawkins seemed so convinced that God doesn't exist that I wondered if he would be willing to put a number on it.
Well, it's hard to put a figure on it, but I mean, I put it as something like, 99% against or something.
Well, how do you know it's 99%?
I don't.
Say it's not 97.
No, I did. You asked me to put a figure on it, and I'm not comfortable putting a figure on it. I think I just think it's very unlikely.
What? But you couldn't put a number on it.
No, of course not.
So it could be 49%.
Well, it would be. I mean, I think it's unlikely, but it's quite far from 50%.
How do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I put an argument in the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry and molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. But that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process.
Why? Because he's already made up his mind that naturalism is the only option. So there has to be, like, he's admitting that, yeah, there's got to be some kind of designer, but it can't be God. So we need some other naturalistic explanation other than God. Well, based on what evidence? Because based on my ideas that I had before I even looked at the evidence, like my preconceived, there's a term called a priori, which means beforehand. Like I've already made up my mind before looking at the evidence that it can't be supernatural.
Yeah, he thinks that aliens.
Yeah, so it's aliens.
Technology.
The aliens seeded life or something. But then all he does is kick the can back the alley a little bit more. Like, well, where did the aliens come from? Well, some other alien. Well, where do they come from? Well, some other aliens. Well, it's got to start somewhere, right?
Couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God.
So the Hebrew God, the God of the Old Testament, he doesn't exist in your view?
Certainly. I mean, that would be a very unpleasant prospect.
And the Holy Trinity of the New Testament?
Nothing like that.
Do you believe in any of the Hindu gods? Like Vishnu?
How can you ask such a question?
You don't,
How
right?
could I? I
You
mean,
believe
why
in-
would I, given that I don't believe in any others?
You don't believe in the Muslim God?
No. Why do you even need to ask?
Well, I just wanted to be sure. So you don't believe in any God anywhere?
Any God anywhere would be completely incompatible with anything that I've said.
I just wanted to make sure you don't believe in any God anywhere.
No.
What if after you died, you ran into God? He said, what have you been doing, Richard? I mean, what have you been doing? I've been trying to be nice to you. I gave you a multi-million-dollar paycheck over and over again with your book, and look what you did.
Bertrand Russell had that point put to him. He said something like, "Sir, why did you take such pains to hide yourself?"
But if the intelligent design people are right, God isn't hidden. We may even be able to encounter God through science, if we have the freedom to go there. What could be more intriguing than that?
Those desks give me flashbacks to school.
All right. So there's just a little teeny bit more that I want to talk about in chapter 2, but we're kind of out of time here. So I'll do that tomorrow, but for next week, if you could, so we're kind of gonna, tomorrow, next week, sorry. I'm used to being at school, right, it's the next day. So I'd like you to also read chapter 3. So now we'll wrap up 2, and now we're gonna start talking about some questions about, we're gonna start talking about some evidence for God, okay? And so the first question is a fascinating question. Why does anything at all exist? Or another way to say it is, why is there something rather than nothing? Like, why is there anything at all? Why are we here? Okay, so I think you'll like these things. This is all called natural theology, by the way, right? Because Romans 1 says that we can know God from the things that he's created. And I think, I'll just say, I have, as I've studied this stuff over the years, it's amazing how much you can know about God from the things that he's created. And so that's what we'll do. So let's just close with prayer. Lord, again, we just thank you for this time that we have to think about these things. We thank you that you've given us a mind to think with. We thank you that you want us to, as you said, love the Lord with all our mind. And we pray that we would do that. And as we seek to understand your love for us and your creation and who you are as you've revealed it to us, so that we may be able to give an answer to those who ask about the hope that we have within us. So we pray that we would do these things diligently for your honor and glory, and you would bless our efforts therein. And we just again pray these things and give you thanks in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.